Spring. The time of year here where the weather inspires you to make something fairy-like, and by the time you're finished with it, it'll be about 85 degrees. I settled on a corset and dug out materials. The green cotton I had planned was a bit harsh under the lace, so I added some satin in between. I found some structural material and plain cotton for the lining. I'll be modifying this pattern I found on clearance. For some reason, they added a 3-inch ease room for a fitting garment, so I went by the finished garment measurements when adjusting the pattern. I did 2 half mock-ups with my biodegradable yard fabric. With my pattern finalized, I cut out the pieces in fusible interfacing. I had thought I had more, so I ended up piecing scraps for the last one. With those all ironed to the lining, it made cutting it easier. Now to cut out the base pieces. I tried to fit them as condensed as possible while staying on the proper grain line. I managed with little waste. Next up was the structural layer, which I cut without precision to save effort. Then I cut out the satin layer. Using the slight transparency of the layers, I sewed a basting stitch satin side up. Sewing on this side keeps the layers from sliding or buckling as much. The seam allowance given was 5/8 of an inch, so this won't be seen. The last layer was the green lace. I've actually had this lovely shade of green lace and the desire to do something for several years now. Now that this thick stack is prepped, it's time to access my cubbyhole of a serger. The knife setting on this machine trimmed away all the excess while sewing a nice finish. Yep, the thread does break periodically and mishaps happened. Eventually I got all the pieces serged. After lining them up starting at the waist marks I had made, I sewed up and down from both points. For a corset, it's important to have a consistent marking to reference from. I also mirrored sewing the seams on the curved ones. I left the seam in the middle since I'll be inserting a separating busk later. The lining was done in the same process. Hopefully the corset won't be too warm with all those layers. I also used the generous seam allowance to create boning channels. This was done by sewing right along the edges. I separated the 2 bust seams horizontally into 2 channels. To give more support, I added some bias tape channels along the front and sides. The color was so cute, but it will have to be covered up. Now for the waist tape. The original directions didn't include a waist tape, but they are very beneficial when making a corset. A waist tape gives support against the tension from cinching the waist. I sewed a grosgrain ribbon along the boning points. With all that done, it's time for the busk. I sewed the right side completely closed and encased the top. For this side of the busk, I marked out where the little holes were going to be. I used a seam ripper and like to make the opening just wide enough for the knobs to poke through. After lining up the other side, I marked where the openings would go along the seam. I followed outside the marks to leave the gaps. I tried to be as precise as possible. Mine were ever so slightly off, which should make a difference. Next, I sewed the corset ends and added the ending boning channel. We're getting close. To keep the front end lining from shifting, I hand sewed along the seams as well as the busk. Now, in the words of YouTuber Prickly Alpaca, it's grommet time. But first, I needed to test one out as this corset is technically 6 layers thick and I've never actually done this before. I didn't have an awl to create a hole, but I did have pruning shears. Since that worked, I marked out the grommet spaces 1 1/8 apart. To further secure the layers before cutting, I hand sewed around each tiny circle. Now to continue the grueling task of carefully snipping and stretching open every hole just big enough to fit the grommet. Let me tell you, I spent literal hours on this. It was very exhausting and the many layers didn't help. I used the first row to line up the other side. I did purposely leave the top tier unfinished for now. Next, I made bias binding out of the satin and lace fabrics. I only sewed one side of the binding together. I really should have made this binding 2 inches wide instead of 1 1/2. For the boning, I used a mix of polyester fish boning and zip ties. Having previously sewn stops for the boning, I cut them to length and inserted them. After hand finishing the bottom binding, I tacked in some bra cups and added my custom label. Following a 1 centimeter allowance, I added the top binding and hand finished those. Then to finish the last 2 grommets and sew the corset lacing. For a finishing touch, I snuck in a hook and eye at the bottom of the busk. This corset laced almost fully closed, so I didn't feel the need to add a modesty panel. I do want to create a coordinating dress to go underneath it. For now, I found other items to make some outfits. Perhaps I'll wear this to a Ren fair. Any ideas?